before I get started, I was actually told to like do a little bit of entertainment, just because the talk is right before lunch. So I was asked to take a selfie with everyone. So I want y'all to just do whatever, woohoo, whatever, and I'm just gonna take a selfie, just because I was asked to capture all your faces right before lunch, because I know we are all hungry. Okay, is everyone ready? Can I get a little bit more enthusiasm? Cool. Ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, awesome. I'm done. Okay, so my topic for today is Beyond the React Native Benchmark. Okay, so my name is Ankita. I'm a solutions architect at Wrangle.io. Wrangle.io is essentially a software consulting firm based out of Toronto. As I mentioned, my talk is Beyond the React Native Benchmark. So I'm going to talk a lot more on like what goes on when a project gets started to like going to production. So when an app is small, we can manage it very easily just because it's small. And when it grows, that's when we got to really think about scalability. But when I think about scalability, it's like there's a lot that goes on. Like you have to consider scalability every step of the way. So a lot of the architecture decisions that we need to take just to make sure that your app can scale well. And when you onboard new developers or work with different clients, it becomes even more important that you know a lot of the best practices embedded in a React Native project. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I consider when I'm working on a project, but also like how to avoid some of the common challenges that I've faced since I started working with React Native. Just to give a little bit of background, I was also a native developer before, and I wanted to like stick with JavaScript, and that's why I quickly switched to React Native. And that's why I feel like just native and React Native works like really well. All right, so how many of you are working towards or already have apps in the App Store? Please raise your hand. That's awesome. I wasn't expecting so many hands, but that's great. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you on a project journey from different sides of the project, right? First, we're going to talk about like different perspectives. So like from a project perspective, from a components perspective, from design perspective, and finally from a release submission perspective. I know that's cute. So from a project perspective. So the first thing that we really need to consider is like bootstrapping your project itself. And when I think of this, for me, like there are mainly like two ways. And this screenshot is from the React Native docs itself. So if you just Google React Native getting started, these docs will pop up. So one way is the Expo CLI way, and the other one is the React Native CLI way. I love Expo. I really love the tool like Snack as well, just because I can like get started with like prototyping like right off the bat. It's great for like apps. I personally have never released an app to production with Expo, so I'm not going to talk a lot about Expo, but what I like about the React Native CLI is that it gives me access to the Android and iOS folders right away, so I can just get started. Personally, when I'm working with clients, it gets a little bit risky just to like tell them to like go for Expo and like go like scale their app. But essentially, with React Native CLI, we have several apps in the App Store, and it has worked really well. Next thing is the directory structure. So now that we actually installed the app, like using the React Native CLI and whatnot, this is kind of like the directory structure that I like to follow. So having like app.js, iOS, Android, which is like pretty standard, but also like having a source folder with screens in it. So what we typically like to do is essentially, let's say you have a login screen, which a lot of apps do if you do have login. What I would like to do is just like start building features based on the screens that you're focusing on. So in this case, like having an index.js file referencing all the other files, actions, epics, reducers, selectors if you're using Redux or any sort of middleware. Also having a common folder with just like modules. And I'll talk a little bit about vertical slicing in a bit. But also having a components folder, which is like essentially all the common components, such as text, buttons, and so on. And store is, again, everything Redux. And this really helps structure the project a lot better. I also find that in terms of like, when your app is small, you can start with this and slowly scale up, right? You don't have to like have this like really ideal project structure from the get-go because every team is different. And even though we have tried to take like specific actions just to make sure that all our app is like app structure is ideal, we always have to iterate and we always have to change. So keep that in mind when you're thinking of like directory structure in general. Adding a package JSON to the root level directory structure, so your imports look, much normal, I would say, than like just going back one directory every time. And this really helps to like, makes it look a lot cleaner as well. Next thing is routing. Selecting the navigation library is a very crucial step in your app's development, be it web app or a React Native app. So any decision needs to be made with like due thought and care because scalability factors in a lot with routing, right? Because as the app grows, your project is going to be in a huge mess if the routing library that you pick is not the right one for your project. So my favorite one is React Navigation. It's a JavaScript-based library. Expo also uses React Navigation, which is great. So a lot of times when I do have to like prototype or test something out, if this is actually going to work for the client that I'm working with, I straight away go to Expo and then move to React Native CLI. And it really helps. The documentation is awesome. It does have like additional like modules for like React Native gesture handler and whatnot. I have used React Navigation in several projects, and we have gone production, and that we have scaled the app, and I had never faced any issues. I know that obviously every library has its pros and cons, and in terms of like performance itself, we did not see any difference in like performance essentially. And a particular thing I love about this library that it works in the concept of navigators. Just because I'm coming from a native world, everything is like a stack, right? And navigators are essentially a collection of different routes, which really helps you to organize. So let's say if you have a bunch of screens, you just use a stack navigator. And if you have a tab at the bottom of the app, then essentially use a tab navigator. And that really makes it easy to follow the paradigm close to the native world. So React Native navigation. So this library is from Wix. And we did have a couple of projects that we use this library because the client had already adopted that. The main challenge with this specific library was that not everyone on the team had the native knowledge, and a lot of developers were pure JavaScript developers. And when we were using this specific package, we were in the initial version of the app, and then there was a major rewrite. So we had to literally spend about 3 weeks migrating from the first version to the second. And just because a lot of architecture decisions were changed, it became a lot harder to like switch. The documentation was okay, just because if I wanted to look for something, I had to like really dig up. And this actually kind of tells me like how documentation is so important, especially when you're like adopting all these different libraries. So instead of like building on top of like React Native, Wix is actually building everything from the ground up. And the main difference between the two libraries is that it's using all the native components. We did see like the gestures and stuff were definitely smoother and stuff, but again, like it wasn't like that big of a difference that I would spend so much time and investment in the library, and then the developers are finding it really hard to like adopt the library itself. So these are some of the challenges and some of the things we should consider when we're like using routing or picking routing. The other question I really like to ask the clients is like, do you have an existing web app, right? Because when we do come, like what I have noticed is that when clients do come to like they want to build an app, it's mainly because of push notifications. Just because obviously everyone wants to bother everyone with like notifications, like, hey, there's this new feature, hey, go check this out. So most likely, they are going to have an existing web app, and I'm sure like we all do, right? And in terms of the web app itself, what we like to do is extract the business logic out. Business logic, in a sense, like obviously the web app is converted into a mobile app, right? The business logic is essentially going to be the same, and it's going to be a lot more common. So essentially moving your business logic to a utility library. So just like create a node module for it, right? And I was asked this question is so common, and I was like, this question has been asked so many times. Just like, so how do you know what to move to a utility library, right? So anything common, right? So essentially like anything pure functions. Anything that is not specifically dependent on the web, and it can easily be moved to native. And this is very, very important, because if you don't, and like if you use like things like the window object in the library, and that's the function you move to the common library, it's not going to work in native because there is no window. Or you have to like patch or like polyfill stuff. So keep that in mind. The other thing is like if you're using like any state management, such as like Redux or something like that, I know like obviously Redux follows the concept of immutability, right? And a lot of the functions are like pure functions. But I would personally like to keep the action and reduces separate from the web and mobile, because if you think about it, it gets really complex. Do we want every time the web team to meet the mobile team just to talk about one specific action so that we can move to a utility library? It's a lot of like back and forth. And just because web navigation is also going to be very different from the mobile navigation as well. So it's very important that to keep these things in mind when you're thinking about the utility library itself. So what were some of the challenges that I faced? Well, a lot of shared context like made it really difficult to like share code. So like essentially in terms of, not just in terms of the business logic, but within the app itself, just because we had so much shared context, so such as like if you're using a login, right? Login or like specifically biometrics, Face ID, Touch ID, if the app goes in the background, we want to pop out like the Touch ID or Face ID, right? And in that case, obviously, that specific service is not common to like one screen. It can be everywhere, right? That's why what we did was we started doing like vertical slicing the module, so like any sort of like authentication, biometrics, any sort of like logout, and so on, right? And this really made it easy for us to like share code. Next, let's talk about from a components perspective. I mean, React Native is also React, right? So when it comes to scalability, obviously we got to think about from a components perspective as well, like how do we want to handle components in general, and how do we want to create components. So first thing is translations. First, like, just because I'm just going to start with English because that's what everyone's familiar with, but depending on the country you are in and what's your first language, it can vary, right? But at the same time, when you're building all these components, especially in a mobile app, a lot of these components could be like related to text, right? Such as like headlines and captions and body text and whatnot. It's very important to consider translations. I really like this library called I18N, and a previous speaker also like mentioned something about that, and which is really great. So essentially, this is like the code that looks like, this is how the code looks like for the headline 2 component that we're using. So we have options for both, because sometimes we didn't want to translate specific text, and sometimes we did want to. So what we did was we essentially created a higher order function called with translate, and that takes in the headline 2 component itself, and depending on like you want to translate or not, it will automatically decide. And this is just like style components, right? And just like basic styling and CSS. So yeah, so essentially like this is like a higher order component, and this is how it looks like, higher order function. Essentially, I'm just calling i18next.t, giving it the key itself. So from an API perspective, you're just passing in the text key from your locale, and it's just going to work. And that really made it easy, because every time we wanted a headline 2 looking component, we can just like use it directly. So, and also we built a lot of common components upfront, just so that we can use them consistently. So one of the popular ones were scroll view, right? Scroll view, because we really needed to consider how scrolling is going to impact in a mobile app, especially like if your app wants to, in terms of like snapping or like specific like list views, tab views, and so on. It was very important to consider. So what we did was we worked with the designer to identify what the common scrolling behavior is going to look like, and accordingly like essentially build a component that uses scroll view and added all these additional properties to it. to be honest, scrolling was so consistent like throughout the app, and it made it look really good. Obviously, there were like these edge cases, but it was fine. Safe area view was another component that we built just because iPhones. Keyboard aware scroll view, just because obviously a lot of these apps also have forms, right? So how the different text components are going to interact with each other. So if you have like two text boxes, how is it going to interact with, like, when you hit next, is it going to go to the next text box, or is it just going to press enter, and so on. And obviously, like these text components that I've been talking about, such as headings, body, captions, and so on. And form components, just because we had this, one of the apps that we built had this huge, like 10-step sign-up process as part of it. All this, like obviously sign up involves like adding text in an input, and we built this input text component, which essentially used forms, like Redux forms, and I know that wasn't the recommendation from a previous speaker from the previous presentation, but we used Redux forms and it worked okay. And also like creating like common buttons as well. The other lesson I should say is that develop Android and Apple at the same time. A lot of times we would get this pushback that, no, we only want to focus on iOS, no Android, or the other way around. But when you're developing all these different components and you're thinking of scalability, most likely in 6 months, one of your stakeholders is going to be like, I have an Android phone, can I download this app on an Android? No, you can't, just because we built it for Apple. So essentially, but if you think of like development and design, right, consider thinking of both those platforms. Apple has, like, they're more strict in terms of like their submission process, and they have these like really detailed human interface guidelines that you want to look at, just because you're not going to approve your app if you don't follow those. So what we essentially did was we usually go with Apple's human interface guidelines just to make sure that there is consistency, and then go from there. So again, it was getting, with components, obviously there's styling involved, and creating basic components was like getting difficult to manage. So when we started off, we obviously had all these different common components, so we had a lot of discussions with like, what is common, what isn't, right? So what we did was we adopted style components for all the design level components. And what I mean by that is all the common components that are going to be used consistently throughout the app, what we did was we used style components. But we use style sheets for any sort of like screen design, because style sheets are great, and in terms of like adding some padding on the screen, or just like how that specific screen is going to look like, we just use style sheet because we found that it was much faster than having the discussion, okay, should we move this into a common folder, and can we wrap this view with this specific like CSS or something, right? And that really helped us a lot because it really, our development was much faster. From a design perspective, so static assets. So for a story, like as a user, I want to see the company's logo in the login background. Obviously, you'll see like a lot of these common stories in your backlog, I'm sure. And the typical way is just like essentially providing like three assets. So essentially, company logo at 2x will be most likely used on an iPhone 7. Company logo 3x will be used on an iPhone 7 Plus or an XS5. And if there's no image matching the screen density, then the closest best option will be selected. And the beauty of this is React Native does that for us, right? But what we found very valuable in terms of like performance itself was that, I'm not going to move, is that React Native vector icons. And we use a tool called Icomoon, just because we just downloaded these vectors, and like we also like imported them as fonts, and that really improved the performance of our app by a lot. And also it was very easy to manage as well. The next thing is just like design tokens. Who here is familiar with the word design tokens? Okay, so I'm going to try my best. I'm sure a designer would do a much better job. But design tokens are essentially a way, like it's essentially a token and a common like theme language between developers and designers, just so that you all can talk you all can reference the same sort of elements in development and design. So essentially, all these are different like categories for design tokens, such as colors, right? Different colors, fonts, font sizes, type scale. These are some things that you will declare in a theme file, and then essentially you're creating tokens. So in things like, instead of calling it like a hex value and just referencing that specific color everywhere, you would call it dark red, light red, and so on. So when you're looking at like your design, you will see light red. So exactly that's what you're going to reference in the code. So in future, if you want to change, let's say, the hex value of dark red, all you have to do is go to this theme file and change it. That really helped us a lot, just because we want designers to be creative, right? And especially like with like playing with colors, type scale, and so on. So when we updated it in one place, it was like updated throughout the app, which is very cool. And Storybook. This is like one of my most like favorite tools ever. So Storybook is a tool that essentially enables developers to create components independently and showcase those components, and you can interact with it, right, in an isolated dev environment. This helped us so much because it helped remove any barriers of communication between design and development. One thing I should say, though, is Storybook with React Native is a little bit tricky, just because it's going to render like native components on screen. So if you think about it, like when you use Storybook on the web, it's great because you just go to your browser and open Storybook, and it's going to be accessible to everyone, right? With React Native, that's not the case. Just because it's the Storybook React Native library, it's going to render native components itself, and you cannot access native components in your browser, right? So what we did was we added essentially a build variant, and we essentially gave the Storybook version of the app to everyone. So essentially, like when you're sending like bills and stuff like that, you're going to get Storybook as a different app itself. And the other cool thing in terms of like, obviously this is great when you're sharing the same app to everyone. But if you want to like use it in your development environment, I don't want to open like a new app and like every time, right? So what we essentially did was, who here is familiar with this menu? I'm sure everyone. So React Native dev menu, right? So what we did was we used that library called React Native dev menu, which essentially adds a dev menu. You don't have to use the library. If you can also like code it yourself. It's not that hard. But essentially what we did was added a Storybook option in here, so it became a lot easier. So all we did was like shake the phone and like opened up Storybook whenever we wanted to modify any components, just so that we can see it quickly. So the biggest hurdle was communication between design and dev. And as I said, Storybook and design tokens really helped help bridge any like communication gaps, essentially. And that was really great. Just because in meetings we would talk about, or designers themselves would be like, we don't have this component yet, and the business is going to be like, we don't have time for that. And we're like, OK, let's just do a variation of this. And that's how we were all like, they were all managing the components in like Sketch and Storybook, which is like very cool. So lastly, from a release submission perspective, one of the important things is the branching strategy. So there's this diagram. I just thought I should just Google a diagram which is like matches very close to what we try to do, and just paste it in here. It's not, it looks complicated, but it's not. I'm going to try my best to explain. So essentially, we only have like two branches. One is master, which is the source of truth, and the second is develop. And develop is essentially going to be your development branch, wherein you push your changes and so on. And then we create feature branches and merge it in develop. Now, any sort of like hotfix or like or any sort of like releases would have its own branch. So for example, when we want to submit an app to the App Store, we obviously want to do frequent updates, right? We don't want to just do like this one huge update. And what we did was we just created this like pre-App Store submission release branch. And whenever we got any feedback from the App Store, we just applied it and merged it back in, that specific hotfix to the master. And it really helped, just to keep things simple. It really helped us a lot. So continuous everything. So CI/CD. Obviously, we want those builds on our machine, right? When you're thinking of mobile, you're thinking of all these different screen sizes. You're thinking of portrait and landscape mode. You're thinking of all these different things. So we use a couple of tools. And it might definitely look like I'm promoting Microsoft, but I'm not, although I love the tools that I've used. So what we wanted was app distribution to devices gets a lot easier. And anyone can get a build and install it on a new device. Obviously, registered devices, that Apple likes to block distribution to all the devices. But if you set up those registered devices properly with the correct provisioning profiles, it's great. And the other thing is pushing live updates. We wanted them to be faster as well. With these couple of Microsoft tools that I'm talking about, it really helped us a lot in terms of distribution of devices, managing like bills, and also pushing live updates. So App Center. Who here is a fan of App Center? Awesome. I'm very happy. So App Center really helped us just because we were able to like build, test, deploy, and repeat, just like they said. It totally looks like I'm promoting Microsoft, but I'm not. But yeah, just like App Center was really helpful. It's very easy to set up. The UI is great. We were able to set up devices and set up provisioning profiles really easily. There were some things we had to go to like specific like Apple and Google Play Store for, but other than that, it was like great. And the most important thing was the bug and regressions, right? And you definitely want to avoid this situation in the first place, but these things do happen. Let's say you have this like your fancy app, and you want to release it to the App Store and Play Store. Obviously, after you release, you realize there's this major bug, because that's how it works, right? You don't realize that there's a bug before that. And you want to definitely avoid this situation as much as possible. So should I wait here for 5 seconds to enjoy this? So code push. Who here has used code push before? This is great. So you all can really empathize with the situation. The benefit of code push is that you can ship hot fixes without going through Apple. So with Google Play Store, it's fine. Like they're not that strict, but it's specifically Apple, they are. With the idea of like code push, what you do is you can like essentially update your JavaScript bundle in production, and you don't have to go through the Apple submission process again. So one of the challenges with the release submission, from a release submission perspective, was that there are way too many tools out there that try to solve CI/CD. We just used App Center, and we loved it. We're consistently doing that. Someone at my company, Aldrin, actually wrote a great blog post on React Native CI/CD on setting up the pipeline, and it's awesome. You all should definitely check it out. Lastly, App Store submission checklist. As I said earlier, read the human interface guidelines carefully, because they are the ones that are really going to save your rejections, Apple from rejecting your apps, right? The other common App Store submission failures were just like, links must be clickable with proper touchable area. And this is like such a common mistake that when we're thinking of like development, obviously like add enough area around the link so that are actually clickable on devices. Obviously, they'll be clickable when you are developing it, but when they go on phones, it's just depending on the screen size, it's just going to get complicated. If you're using a third-party provider, such as like Google OAuth or Facebook OAuth or something like that, please provide more info in your App Store submission process. And there's a section when you're submitting an app to the App Store on like any sort of like additional info that you can provide. Please, please, please provide lots of details, just because the people who are testing it are they're just humans just like us. They want more context, and once they do get that context, they're going to give that info. And lastly, like setting up a test account. If you have a login, set up a test account so that it becomes a lot easier for them to like log in and test out the app. And these are some of the common like App Store submission failures that we have noticed. 2 more slides, and we'll be good for lunch. Animations with Lottie. So as you can see, like this is Airbnb, and Lottie is a library for like different platforms, and it parses the Adobe After Effects animations, and we can export it as a JSON file, right? And you can render them natively on web and mobile to get a consistent experience. Just to make our apps look a little fancy, we use Lottie, which is really cool. I honestly used that like a few months ago. I didn't know that. Many people did, which is very cool. And push notifications. Please, please, please use a provider for push notifications. There was a time when I was doing native development, and we literally spent a month just doing push notification. A good provider is OneSignal. OneSignal. There's a typo there. And just because I was doing a lot of GDPR recently, we were using OneTrust as a provider. That's why I just added it in. It's actually OneSignal. But yeah, like definitely use a provider. It will make your life a lot easier for push notifications. All the device management and everything is just easily done. So yeah, this is pretty much the end. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, make it positive. Catch me after. I'll be around for lunch and during the day as well. And thank you so much for listening.